As Megan mentioned, I'm a project manager with the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association. I started back in 1995 as a volunteer, as probably Megan did, and through, I guess, a matter of attrition.
Can I get you to scoot back just a little bit?
Okay, sorry.
Just so we can see you in the screen.
Oh, I
here.
apologize about that.
Sorry.
Okay, technology. So I was very fortunate. Again, did an internship through Western Washington University and managed to get a job as at that point, we were kind of spread thin. I think I was doing presentations in classrooms. I was running a juvenile offenders crew. I was running a dislocated natural resource workers crew. And I think shortly after that, we got our first Washington Conservation Corps crew. And it's been a great ride. It's been a wonderful job, wonderful place to work. One thing I'm most passionate about is fish passage barrier removal. And I did this presentation for the Salmon Recovery Funding Board. They have a biannual conference down in Vancouver, Washington, where a lot of restoration practitioners get together and talk about their projects, things, lessons they've learned. And so I kind of have this presentation kind of canned. I've added a couple extra slides, maybe I'll give you a little bit more explanation about fish passage. And I'm just going to jump right in. The reason it says 2005 to 2022, when I started in 1995, we didn't have a lot of funding and we were maybe doing 1 or 2 fish passage projects a year. And then something changed, and that's what kind of led to this presentation. So I'll talk a little bit more about what changed in the next couple of slides. Megan said, maybe you should start off by explaining what fish passage barriers are. And I thought, boy, I haven't really thought about that, but here's one. And this would be fairly typical. And I don't think there was any kind of malice or bad intent. A landowner decided they needed to get across a creek, maybe to do some logging practice on the other side, or access a farm field on the other side, or get to a house they're planning to construct on the other side. So we'll install a culvert. And I think there again, there was no malice or bad intent, but the culverts were typically too small for the creek they were installed in. They were generally not placed or embedded properly within the stream channel. And so this is kind of a very typical scenario of what we see. So the culvert's a little small. It's also placed a little high in the profile of the channel. And what occurs pretty quickly after that is you'll see this, in the forefront, that pool, we would call a plunge pool. So the water coming out of that pipe is actually scouring that pool. So maybe when they first put it in, the elevation was fine, fish could pass through this culvert. But over time, it is scouring down, and now you have what we call an outfall drop. So it's pretty hard for fish to get into that pipe, well, specifically because it's dry at this point in time, because it's perched above the channel. There's other reasons, you might not have a outfall drop. You may have a culvert that's generally just too steep. The water moves too quickly for fish to migrate it. But this is probably a very typical scenario. So I thought I would start with that before I get into the what changed in 2005. So I should back it up. It happened before 2005. So prior to 2003, the county kept a list of primarily culverts that they needed to maintain, not really inventorying them as whether they were fish passage barriers or not. Department of Transport, state highways, they were kind of keeping their own inventory. Maybe the city of Bellingham had a list, but there wasn't really one conclusive list, and not everybody was measuring things the same way. So in 2003, the county applied for funding to do an inventory of all of Whatcom County, or water resource inventory area 1. And we partnered with the county and the Nooksack tribe, And we were tasked with inventorying all barriers on private property. And that said private property where we were allowed access. So I just kind of mentioned there, you know, everybody's got culverts, not all of them are barriers, but at that point in time, really nobody knew which culvert was a barrier and who owned it. So Whatcom County arranged with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to come up and teach us a protocol, which is kind of the universal protocol they use. That's a level A survey. And what you do is essentially just like in that past picture, you're going to take elevations of that pool drop, or you're going to take elevations of the slope of a culvert. You're going to look at the upstream habitat and the downstream habitat that's available for fish if they were to get past that barrier. And then you can generate this priority index number, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And that's what allows you to kind of look at apples to apples. So we, again, we're tasked with private barriers, and all of the data that we collected was then put in an Access database, which is a Microsoft product, but it's a little more powerful than a spreadsheet in that you can query it. You can say, I want to look at all the barriers on Starry Creek, or I want to look at all the barriers that have a PI of a certain level. So it kind of allows you to kind of weed out and prioritize. And I mentioned this priority index number. So it's a valueless number, but it's weighted. And what it does is, let's say in that first scenario where I showed you that picture, that is a barrier to all fish at all times. Then you would go upstream and do an assessment of all the habitat that is available above that. And then that gets weighted again by what species would use it. Would it be an ESA listed steelhead? Would it be an ESA listed early Chinook? Would it be coho? And all those fish have different weights. And then that generates a number. What that allow you to do with, if the barrier was in Eastern Washington or if it was in Forks, you would have a number that would rank that against all other barriers. So it gives you a great way to prioritize what projects you should tackle first. But this was my most favorite thing, and probably my first introduction to GIS. All of the data we collected was spatially recognized, so it knows where you are when you're doing this survey. And so it was all plotted on a map. And so in this case, you could see all of the culverts and you could see all of the barriers in a creek. And then you could say, okay, well, if we address this one and then the county addresses that road and the DOT addresses highway, you could eliminate all the barriers in an entire watershed. So to me, this was the most powerful tool that came out of that. And I'm not patting our backs, again, it was the county that did this, but this was kind of the first database of its kind at that time. And since then, there's all kinds of incredible data, specifically Salmonscape, which is managed by Department of Fish and Wildlife, where you can look at every barrier in the entire state. So these were the number of crossings that we assessed. And there's a little more than 800 that were barriers, and some of those are complete barriers, like no fish get up them at any time. Other ones were just partial barriers, so maybe in particular strong winter flows, the culvert has a bit of slope, fish can't migrate through it, or low summer flows, fish can't migrate downstream through the pipe. So now we have all this data, and now we want to go and start removing fish passage barriers. Option one, obviously, if people aren't using the crossing anymore, it would just be to pull the old crossing out, regrade the channel to try and match the upstream and downstream gradient and cross section and walk away. That's seldom the case. Most people still want access. Our next priority would be to replace a culvert with a bridge. And I'll go into a little more about why we would choose a bridge over a culvert later in the presentation. The last option would be to put in a culvert, but this time we were going to use a culvert that's considerably larger, and we're going to countersink it into the channel to allow that channel either to grade, like build up, or degrade within the size of the culvert. So I don't know the exact number, but I think we came in under budget on that assessment, about $35,000. And the county was like, we should just give that money back. And I'm like, well, we know these barriers, we could go out and collect a bunch of data for design. So it allowed us to take that money and then go out with our total station, which is a little antiquated for people that survey today, but we kind of all learned how to use it, and it works. And we'd go out and take measurements. Like I said, we're going to look at the channel width outside of the influence of that culvert. So we're going to go upstream of the barrier, collect 3 different cross sections. We're going to go downstream, collect 3 different cross sections. We're going to look at the profile, not through the culvert, but starting at least 150 feet upstream to 150 feet downstream to what the gradient would be if the culvert wasn't there. We're going to look at what the bed material is. So this topographical survey then would allow us to put it into AutoCAD and generate plans. And so I think with that funding, we were able to address or create plans for the top 15 projects that we wanted. And so then again, we went back into a database and we looked at what is the problem, what would be the best appropriate fix. At that point, we were just like, well, culverts are cheaper. We should just replace smaller culverts with bigger culverts. And after some practice, we learned that that's not always the case. So you've got these designs, you've got this database telling you where the barriers are, and now you got to go look for money. And very fortunately, there were a couple of programs that came into existence right after this. And one was the Family Forest Fish Passage Program. And that is aimed at forest landowners who have inherited barriers. So if you're a large forest landowner like Sierra Pacific, you have a road management abandonment plan that you have to have in order to log or remove timber, meaning that you are going to build all your crossings in accordance with WDFW specs. And then when you're done, you're going to pull those crossings and move back out. But let's say somebody subdivided a piece off of a forest parcel and somebody built a house on it, and then you buy that house, but there's all these kind of abandoned forest roads up in the forest land behind your house. The reason that this was legislated was that you shouldn't be burdened with the removal of that because you never installed those pipes. So if you have forest land, that program is wonderful. There were a couple other smaller programs, Landowner Incentive Program. It's no longer in existence. U.S. Fish Wildlife Partners for Fish and Wildlife. That program's always not in existence anymore, but there were programs you could apply to. They're competitive, but it was particularly fruitful if you had this PI number and you had a design, even if it wasn't 100% design, like you were ready to go, you were much more apt to get funding than to just go and say, well, we think we've got a barrier, we need you to give us some money. So that was wonderful. The Natural Resource Conservation Service Environmental Quality Incentive Program has funded more of our projects than any other program. It's federally funded. It's administered through the Conservation District in Whatcom County. And it will work it was designed originally to work with agricultural landowners, but it can also do forest landowners. It just has to be a property where there has been some commercial income. So you sold hay or you cleared some timber, and it's a very low threshold. I think there has to be $1,000 in earnings on that property. In some cases, private landowners have said to us, I just want to pay for it. I don't want to deal with the government. I don't want to sign anything. And that's kind of rare, but I would say about 1 a year, somebody just says, we'll pay for it. FEMA, as most of you know, if you live here in Whatcom County or anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, in November of 2021, with the big flooding, a lot of private roads washed out, state highways washed out, county roads washed out. So a lot of people no longer had access to their house. In some cases, FEMA stepped forward and was willing to replace their crossing, but then these people didn't really know what to do. So we worked with a number of landowners who got money through FEMA that they channeled to us to replace their crossing. Lessons learned, and I'll get in. I won't go into all of these because I'm going to cover some of them in future slides. But yeah, you learn some things, especially if you haven't done many in-stream fish passage projects before. And and as you learn, you learn shortcuts, or you meet more people that can help you out. You get good relationships with good contractors who are really efficient. But I'll just touch on a few things that we learned. As I mentioned, we had this old total station, and for those of you that don't know, it is like and ours is kind of antiquated, but it's a piece of survey equipment, which once you program it, it knows where it is in space in 3 dimensions. And then you can just use that to take elevations and points, and then it will know where all those points are. And as I mentioned, then you can take it into a program like AutoCAD and create a site plan and get all of your elevations. So we figured we already have this and most of us can run it. Why would we pay somebody else to survey it? So we started doing that. We found some students who had taken AutoCAD. I studied AutoCAD for a while. I'm terrible at it. I can do a little bit of quality control in AutoCAD, but I can't draw. So we found people that weren't engineers, but could draft plans. We found a few retired soil engineers would help us out with foundation designs. We worked with a number of hydraulic engineers in Whatcom County who've helped us. If you build a crossing that provides access or emergency vehicle access, it has to be fully engineered and has to come up with the fire marshal standards for fire truck crossing and any other vehicle that would cross it. So we can't stamp plans, but we were again working with some very generous engineers who could stamp plans for us, create reports, come back and do an as-built plan, which we need to submit again to the county or the fire marshal when we're completed. Permitting, yeah, those are some lessons learned with permitting. You kind of picked what's gonna, how would I say this? So if you want to do a project in 2024 and you need an Army Corps of Engineer permit for that project, then you should start on that right away, because that's going to take the longest. It's going to require consultation regarding ESA listed species. It's going to require a cultural resource check. And it's just a slow moving machine. So you would, if you knew that's what you needed, you would get on that right away. If you're going to need a land disturbance permit or a SEPA approval, those again are going to, not the land disturbance permit, but the SEPA is going to take a fair bit of time. So you get started on that right away. It's not hard or onerous. They're pretty standard applications, but you should just definitely think it's going to take some time. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, which requires anybody who reaches over a stream, like just waves something over a stream, that you need a permit, whether there's water in the creek at that time or not. You just move over the bank, you should have what they call a hydraulic project approval. They have a pretty streamlined process. It takes about 45 days from the day you submit. So that's not one that we're necessarily worried about, but other things like utility relocate, we never really dealt with. We're doing with utilities. We dealt with, some private wiring or plumbing over old farm crossing. But then when we came to find out, well, if we deal with PSC, you're dealing with a sole source contractor, a telco. If you're not familiar with that, it takes a long time when you come out and move a power line. So there's just little things you learn. I mentioned bridges versus culverts. So I had also talked about replacing smaller culverts with bigger culverts and then embedding them into the channel. So the site on the left, that is a 12-foot culvert. So it's bedded into the ground 6 feet. And so when you install that culvert, you have to dig a very big hole. The culvert strength is in its bedding, which means you're going to compress gravel in 8-inch lifts along the side of it, all the way up to maintain the integrity of that oval. This isn't an oval, this is a circular pipe. Even more so if you have a squash or oval pipe. Once you do all that, then you got to fill the pipe half back in, and you can do a 12-foot pipe. You can run a small skid steer into it. Anything smaller than that, you're kind of doing it by hand. Then, as you also notice, there's a lot of armoring around the edge of the pipe to support the roadway and stop the water from wanting to get around it. If you have utilities in that roadway, you're going to need at least 2 feet of fill. So we found that by the time we installed that 12-foot pipe and all the associated fill and gravel, it was cheaper just to do the bridge. And the bridge on the right as a 30-foot bridge. I mean, you literally have just removed the culvert, regraded your channel, dug your foundation, drop your bridge on top. I mentioned that the reason for embedding that pipe is to allow for changes. And you can allow for quite a few changes, but you can't really allow for a large tree falling down and fixing itself perpendicular to the pipe, and then a bunch of other stuff piling up behind that, and then the water decides to go around the road completely. So bridges give you a lot more flexibility. When we design our bridge projects, there is a certain amount of clearance so that wood should be able to move. I mean, obviously a huge tree might not get under that bridge, but in that case, in this size of creek, that tree would probably not move. So we kind of came to the realization that bridges were better. Well, they're better for maintenance, and they're cheaper, and they're easier in the long run. So I mentioned clearance. So one thing that a hydraulic engineer does for us when we hire them to do a project is they look at the basin area above the culvert. They look at the hydrology, so how much rain is going to fall in that basin. And then they can use a model to generate certain storm events, or what you would call a 100-year event. A lot of rain, or rain on snow. What would the water surface elevation be at your cross section under your bridge? And the Department of Fish and Wildlife, they used to require 1 foot, 2 feet. Now I think they're at 3 feet. The funding agency I mentioned, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they require a minimum of 2 feet. So you have to run this model and then raise your bridge to make sure you have that clearance. And again, that's allowing large trees or wood to move under the bridge. So we were buying concrete bridges and we were buying steel bridges. And I'll get into a little more about the reason for that, because the different applications work better in different situations. So in this case, that concrete bridge on the left is 11 inches thick. And it's rated HS20. So it'll carry a fire truck, it'll carry a septic truck, it'll carry a logging truck. The bridge on the right is steel and it's 30 inches deep. So if we need that additional clearance to get the 30-inch, we just got to keep lifting the bridge up. And then we create kind of a causeway with long approaches. And then you're spending a lot of money on gravel. So where it was appropriate, we would try and use these concrete bridges, and we still do today. Access considerations, I'm just like, steel is kind of nice because you can drag it around, bang it up. It really, you might put a little dent in it. You can't do that with the concrete. I mean, you just touch it the wrong way, especially with a big piece of equipment, and you will break parts of it off. So sometimes it was far easier to use a steel bridge. I just wanted to give you an example. I was talking a little bit about grade and grade control. One thing we did learn early on, if you were going to do more than one culvert in a reach, and this I think we did 5 over a period of 2 years. If you just adjust for where your crossing is and try and anticipate where the gradient would have been, but you're not really accounting for everything that's upstream, and it'll become apparent when I show you a picture of the plans, is how in that little culvert picture I showed you initially, it's scouring at the bottom. But at the back, it's a grading. Gravel is piling up because it cannot get through the pipe. So you would get this kind of step through the prism of the culvert. So if you just adjust for your step, but then you go upstream a little bit, there's another culvert that's doing that or worse, then that has changed the gradient for your culvert. And then you go upstream and it's changed the gradient again. So if you do not take all of that into effect, you might put it in and think, oh, it's all fine, and then it becomes a barrier. So I think I've got a few plan sets in here. So this is gets a little more complicated because you want the creek to adjust naturally, but you can't have it adjust all at once. So you end up putting a lot of grade control. You shoot your elevation instead of the 150 feet on either side of the pipe. Maybe you shoot it 2,000 or 3,000 feet through all of the pipes. And then you get to what you think would be an appropriate profile for that creek. It's not perfect, but as close as you can get. But then while things are adjusting, you have to hold that gradient. So in this, I'm not seeing it so clear with my glasses, but you can see the first barrier, I guess would be to the right. You can see the big drop, and then there's another drop, and then there's another drop. So you're trying to take into account to all of those drops. So this is a picture of that same site. So this is the second most upstream. There's 5 in a row. This had the biggest drop, probably about an 8-foot drop. So again, to do the one upstream of this, we had to know if you took this drop away, where would the creek end up? So that's where we're kind of shooting these longer profiles. And in this case, we're using some bigger cobble, we're using some wood, try and slow water down and just let it find its new gradient. Similar on this project, there was 3 barriers, I guess there was 4 barriers in a row, but the most downstream one had almost a 10-foot drop and has been there for 50 years. No fish had ever got above this. So we can't just remove this, just where we think we're going to have to, well, we could just remove this, but if we're going to do the 3 upstream, we kind of have to figure out where that gradient is going to be. So again, we're doing a very long survey. This, again, a site, no worry about clearance. I mean, there's probably 15 feet under that bridge. So steel is a nice option, easier to work with. Some things you can't anticipate. So there's a 70-foot bridge we put on Hardscrabble Creek, a tributary to the South Fork. We finished the project in early October. In November, there was a similar event, rain on snow event, and they had a debris flow, and that wood all piled up against the bridge like in one event. And fortunately, only pushed the bridge about 6 feet off its foundation. So we had to go back to the people that funded it. Can you help us move some of this wood? And can we put the bridge back on? And they were generous and helped us out. So that was wonderful. So since we completed the inventory, we've removed 132 fish passage barriers, improved access to over 150 miles of upstream habitat. We try and do an average of 5 barriers a year. Sometimes we may do 10, some years we may do 4. I think we have 6 scheduled for this year. So it's a long list, as you saw, like there's 800 and something barriers. So there's great job security in this business. As long as people will give you the money. And this is again what I wanted to talk a little bit about, what I thought was so great to come out of this. After you had this GIS database, you could start to narrow down and say, well, Mr. Jones will let us do this, and then Sheila Brown upstream will let us do this, and then if the county does this. So this is an example of some Squalicum Creek private crossings. So I think there's 14 or 15 crossings in there. And then the one in orange is the project that's messing with your trip to Mount Baker right now. So that is Squalicum Creek. And that is a big project.
I want everybody to know it's right at our driveway.
Oh, so you got to go all the way. Hopefully you're on this side. Oh, good. If you're on the other side, you got a long drive around. So, yeah, it's going to cause definitely some discomfort and some traffic jams, but that will be the last barrier on the main stem of Squalicum Creek. So once that's done, so we're kind of excited about it, but I'm not stuck on the other side of it right now. So here's just some examples of projects we've done on that Squalicum Creek site. So this has, I think, another 70-foot or 80-foot bridge. Again, no worry about clearance. Well, this I wish I might have a picture later on or in the end. I don't know if I've covered it, but if somebody put in a small pipe, they're like, well, that isn't going to work. We'll put in a second pipe. I've seen where you keep digging down and there's 3 or 4 pipes below those 2 pipes. So you just keep adding pipes, which really doesn't help you in the long run. So yeah, the back one, when I went there, I said, obviously no clearance problems. We're dragging this bridge through the woods. It's nice to use the steel. This one, we did have clearance issues, so we went with the concrete. This is just this was a recent one last year, another forest road. And what was nice is you can just kind of get in there with, as big equipment as you need, but not any bigger. So you're doing as little damage as possible to the creek. This one I put in there because there's opportunities that arise. So if we get onto somebody's property to do a fish passage, they'll say, well, hey, you could use some more trees. We could plant some more trees. In this case, this is a farmer. Has 2,250 feet of Squalicum Creek, all in ag. Super nice guy. And we said, well, you've got a bunch of failing banks. If we come up and do the bridge, could we, put the banks back together and plant the entire 2,250 feet? And he said, sure. It's not the biggest buffer in the world, but it's huge. So we're really excited about that. So yeah, the crew's been planting that all winter. We do not do dam removal projects, and we cannot take credit for this, but I would like, I guess, to make a case that that is or was a complete barrier. But I would say cumulatively, all the small pipes create far or reduce fish access far more than this dam ever did. So I think it's a good thing that it got removed, and it cost a fortune. But I think that cumulatively all the small barriers make equally big impact. We do remove dams, and they're the funnest projects. I think we've only removed about 4. So this was an old concrete dam, was keeping water ponded for agriculture, and just had slowly filled in. Great landowners. They tried to build this little ladder out of extruded aluminum, but it wasn't really working. Yeah, it was a very fun project. So I mentioned there's still a few out there. So this is on High Creek. I've been talking to this landowner for over 10 years. He's not really interested. He's not mean or anything. He's just not really interested. He likes that little waterfall. But I'm hoping one day, well, the one that you saw that had the 12-foot drop, I had talked to that person for over 10 years before they let us do it. So you just keep coming back and being persistent. And the reason I put this slide in here is because they talk about lessons learned. I think persistence is probably the best lesson. Like, don't be deterred. Just keep going back and asking. They'll only say no. And there is a person at the conservation district named Frank Corey, who was actually a WC supervisor with us in the late 90s, mid-late 90s. And he works for the conservation district. He runs that environmental quality incentive program, and he perseveres. I mean, he helps me find funding for all kinds of stuff I think I would never get funded. You know, he just says, well, we'll just keep trying. So it is just wonderful to have him as a partner. And that is it, I think. So definitely welcome to ask some questions. And if I went too fast, I could probably even go backwards and find a slide if you had a question about something. Yes.
So how much do the bridges cost?
So, this is a good question. The steel and the concrete are comparable in price. The concrete is typically about, it's not going to let me get back in. Maybe it will. Well, I don't necessarily need to have the slide. If you can get me back in, yeah, that'd be great. These are better in mind. So the bridges we used are pre-engineered. So they're stamped, and they have, whether they're built in Missoula, Montana, or Merritt, British Columbia, where the concrete bridges are built. They come with an engineer stamp from Washington State. So you literally just have to put them on an engineered foundation at an appropriate elevation, and then you're good to go. The price of steel has been going up steadily. The price of concrete, and these concrete bridges obviously have a lot of steel in them too. That's been going up. I just got to go back in. Yeah, okay, I'll just find one of those bridges. So that, I think they're both 40 feet. And I think this year we go out and we get 3 quotes for each bridge. And I would want to say the concrete's a little less. It's probably about 42,000. The steel one's probably closer to 48,000. Like I say, it's fully engineered. So it's not cheap. And fortunately, again, there's been some great funding programs. If you have a barrier, there is probably a program that would pay to fix it at no cost to yourself. A little bit of inconvenience, but most of these projects take 3 or 4 days. And if there is a power need, we'll put in generators, keep people's houses, fridges cold, and washer and dryers running. So I don't know if that gives you an idea. So by the time that was installed, and this has been an older bridge, it's probably closer to like 2005 or 2010, all in, we were probably about 60 grand. Today, probably be closer to 80 grand. Because again, you haven't noticed, there's 2 big gravel companies, and there used to be 6. It's a bit of a monopoly, and rock has gone up accordingly with everything else, trucking, fuel. Any other questions? Yes.
In most cases, are the bridges, 2-lane bridges or they?
Yeah, so the county fire marshal sets a requirement for width. So it used to be 1 to 2 residences. You were okay with 12 feet, but I think they just recently changed that. So I think one residence, you're 12 feet. I think 2 to 3, you're now 16 feet. If you're 3 to, I might have jumped, might have been 14, then 16. When you have more than 5 residences, it's a 2-lane road. So it's a 20-foot bridge. So it gets pretty expensive pretty fast when you have multiple residences. But what I always tell people, like I look at the zoning, I look at the parcel layer. You don't want to build this bridge more than once. If your property is subdividable and you think you're going to build, or you're going to try and subdivide and build another house, you should build a bridge for that use. Because you're just going to have to redo it all again. So yeah, it is kind of expensive once you get into multiple residences. But hopefully then again, you have 5 people to share the cost of that bridge and not 1.
That's the hard part, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder. The most expensive is one landowner doing it by themselves, obviously. Any other questions? Yes.
In your priority indexing, you're looking at like available habitat upstream and whatnot. Is the quality of habitat a
Yes.
weighting factor?
Yep, that is weighed into it too. So when you do a habitat assessment, you're not only measuring units of habitat, you're grading the quality of that habitat. So that weighs into it also. Yeah.
Is that pretty subjective or objective?
It isn't. It is somewhat subjective. I mean, I think that, if I walk through it and another crew, we might rate things a little, but they do give you protocols and what to look for and how to measure things. But it could be a little subjective. Yeah.
So Darrell, you've been doing this almost 30 years.
Yeah. Wow.
We had ample opportunity to go back upstream where your new barriers, what did you see?
So as part of our program, I'm sorry, I know you have a question. As part of our construction program or restoration program, there's always monitoring. So we will monitor all these sites for a minimum of 3 years just to see. Well, we do it primarily with adult spawner surveys. So if we did a project in the summer, we're going to do a spawner survey upstream of that site the following fall, early winter. And if we don't see fish, we're going to do it next year. And if we don't see fish, we're going to do it next year. Because if you had like that one case where you had that 10-foot drop and no fish have been above it for 50 years, sorry, it might take fish a while to stray. As fish go, or salmon go to their innate streams and spawn there. But it's funny, as we were finishing that project, we were a little behind. It was probably mid-October. We got an extension on our permit. The day we finished, fish came through there.
Which one was that?
That was on Goodwin Creek, a tributary to the Sumas, and a lot of fish came through there. People were just amazed how many fish came through there, but that isn't always the case. I mean, you could remove a culvert on a small tributary of a creek that flows in the Nooksack. It may take a while for fish to find that. And we'll be equally interested in juvenile presence. It's a little hard. It's much easier to find a dead carcass of an adult than it is to find fry, but we do make an effort to go out and look for juveniles. Because I think that was one of the main stumbling blocks. And earlier we say, well, we just got to get adult fish up there. We'll just build a weir. We'll just build a ladder, but they don't work very well for juvenile fish. And coho are probably the most ubiquitous species of salmon we have in Whatcom County. I mean, they're everywhere, ditches and stuff, and they move a lot. They stay in the freshwater for a year, maybe a little longer, get a little bigger, get a little fatter. That's their strategy before they leave. And so they migrate all through a system. So yes, an adult might be able to jump into that pipe at some certain CFS, at some rain event in the winter, but a juvenile in the summer is just going to get stuck. So I think when Department of Fish and Wildlife put all these protocols together and said, we want to address multiple species, multiple life stages all the time. And I didn't really get into it, but we used to do a little bit of ladder, kind of rock weir stuff, and that was kind of shut down at the end of the 90s because you say, well, you're not fixing the problem. You're just kind of a band-aid staircase fish up through something. And I guess I should have pointed out that I feel sediment transport is equally as important as fish passage. So a creek is going to adjust the hydrology, again, the amount of rain that falls in that watershed and whatever sediment is present and available to the creek. And that's going to adjust the whole morphology, the whole shape of the creek, the shape of the bed, the pools, the riffles. If you just stop that gravel flow, people have heard, have you ever heard the term hungry water? I mean, water doesn't get hungry, but water without sediment will cut down. So one of the reasons that water coming out of that pipe at the first picture is cutting down, it doesn't have any sediment in it, or it doesn't have enough sediment, and it's trying to reach some new equilibrium. So sorry, you're very patient there.
So, NC does a project, bridge on the right,
Yeah,
and you get enough money to put it in. Are you guys done the?
we signed a pretty strict landowner agreement, like the bridge is yours. And that said, if if a tree fell down on it, we'll come out and help, or if you need, so your road surface is kind of failing, maybe we didn't bed the gravel well enough, we'll definitely come back. But and I think people appreciate it, like, we're on your property to do this project with your permission, and after we leave, it's yours. We do again ask them if we can come back for 3 years. I don't think we've ever had a no, just to look at fish passage above that crossing, but for all intents and purposes, it is their bridge.
No, it's not your financial burden.
Yes, exactly. And we're very hopeful. I mean, I've never, other than a couple of people that have said, maybe we didn't get the angle right with the road, and water flowed onto the bridge and started to, pool. And then as vehicles went across it, it started to create potholes. So we go back and adjust that. We have had people where big trees, well, that one I showed you where all the wood piled up, would go in there and remove that wood or remove the tree. We're always, we'd love to go back out and see the bridge, but I think, a lot of people are fairly private. They're generous to let us on their property and then wave goodbye when we leave. So. Any other questions? Yes.
This one's really close to home, Darrell. We don't, if you'd like, you can just defer it. So when I was looking at the Swallow Creek fires that they had up there, they're upstream of the Mount Baker Highway right now, where they built the bridge, upstream of that, prior to the lake. I want to say I saw 3 or 4 projects in there. That, like, the earliest one was like around 2008 or 9 or something. So those were being done.
Knowing that DOT one would be done.
Oh,
Well, I shouldn't say that. I'll back up a little bit. So we would typically, if we said, well, boy, say there's no court injunction, DOT is not on the hook to replace all this stuff. We'd be pretty hesitant to do something above a complete barrier on a DOT crossing. So we worked in Darrell Creek for a number of years, and there was a complete barrier on Grandview. We didn't do anything above that until they did that. That said, the Squalicum Creek crossing, when it was done, and I don't know how they did this because I know DOT does not like to work outside of their right of way, but it was found to be a fish passage barrier, and to solve that problem, they built a series of log weirs. And I think there was maybe 8 or 10 of them outside of the DOT right of way. So they must have dealt with the 2 private landowners on either side of that creek and built these log weirs. And yeah, it looks wonderful. It's a staircase, but logs rot and fall apart. And when DOT a couple times said, well, that's not a barrier. And I'm like, I've seen it. It's a barrier. Like the two bottom weirs were completely gone. There was concrete that was pinning these logs in. There were big drops. And I took the Department of Fish and Wildlife for something like, this is a barrier. And I think, DOT would have come to that realization eventually. But the moment the court injunction came out, they have to fix it. So where I was going with that is fish were getting up there. They just was very hard. So we felt DOT is going to do this eventually. They're going to have to. And we're going to go ahead and start doing these upstream. And then the moment they put it on the plan, it was originally on the plan for 2021, then 2022, now 2023. Sounds like you're familiar with that. So at that point, when we saw it coming up, we're like, okay, we're going to go do these last few upstream that were closer to the lake.
so there was a court injunction against Washington.
Yes, and then
then
all state,
pardon?
all barriers
Oh,
on
okay.
DOT roads in the state. It's a heavy lift. I mean, they think the court injunction gave them 30 years there's no way, but I mean, they're making better progress than I thought, because that's a big, bureaucracy, pretty slow moving machine, and they're doing all kinds of projects. And whether you say well, you look at, should be careful what I say. Nobody lives on Paddon Creek. I mean, the amount of money that must have cost to get that through there, and fish can only get so far, and then there's a dam at the lakes. That's a lot of money. I don't know if I'm going to spend it there, but they don't have any choice. They have to. Yes.
You guys ever run into the situation where you create the passage and it interferes downstream with somebody who didn't get that much water because it backed up somewhere higher, all of a sudden it's become their problem?
We have not. I mean, I have to think, and as I get older, my memory's not that great. I may have had a couple of people that have called and said, can you come look at this? You just released all this water. I don't remember anything that we couldn't, solve by doing something in addition to our site, and we're never restricted like DOT is to work in our own right of way. We'll work on anybody's property. I can't say that there's been anyone that's just been, literally angry and we're going to take you to court. That said, and I hear this complaint a fair bit with DOT and the railway, they don't care who's downstream. I mean, they'd remove that crossing, and the next poor person down the road that has the tiny crossing, their crossing is going to get washed out. And Grandview Business Park, when DOT did that small crossing on the highway, and then BNSF did it on their railroad grade, it all came into a 6-foot pipe in Grandview Business Park. Whether you think Grandview Business Park should be there or not, I don't know, but it just flooded the entire park. And DOT is just like, it's not our problem. They don't take into account any downstream effect, which to me seems kind of weird, because you're kind of the gatekeeper. I mean, the pipe was undersized and it has been backing up water, and so everybody else downstream has kind of built their crossing based on what that culvert will allow through, and then you take that away.
So that a function of you guys are mostly working on smaller creeks?
Well, I would say we're working on pretty small creeks, and we are looking at what downstream is. I mean, you have to write that into all your applications for funding, like what impacts will you have on other properties around you, because nobody wants to get into litigation. So,
But how far do you have to look?
we will look as far as people will say till you can't go. We're just like, we would want to see it. So when those original barrier inventories were done, we're literally walking up the creek through everybody's property until somebody says, nope. So we walk out, go around, jump back in. So there may be some gaps that we haven't seen, but on those creeks where you see all the barrier, we've walked the entire creek. And we used to do it a little, a little lower in the channel with a hat on if we didn't have permission, just get across it, but. Yeah. Sorry, any other questions?
So, if you look at Whatcom County and how much work there is to do of this site in Whatcom County, is there an insight?
Yeah, I think there is. I think sadly, or not sadly, it's just circumstance. We didn't get on everybody's property. So there's probably some out there that we have never seen. There are probably some that have been installed illegally without permits since we did that. So, we could be off by 100, but we have a list and we're working down it. And I think with, aerial coverage, whether you can get on a site or not physically, you can look at aerial coverage and you start to see water ponded in an aerial. You're like, something's blocking up that water. So I think I'm optimistic that you could eliminate all barriers. I guess at some point you come down to cost benefit. So that PI number in the projects we start be like, so let's say the Middle Fork Dam, that would be a PI in the high 40s. For our initial projects, we're in the low 40s, high 30s. Now we're down into the low 20s. At some point, somebody's going to say that probably isn't worth fixing. Once you get down to 10, there's just limited amount of habitat gain. There's no listed species present. It'd probably get hard to fund a project like that, but there's still a lot of 20s around. And there are a lot of state and county culverts and city culverts. The city is redoing their whole inventory right now.
So at what point, I mean, at what percentage is the habitat within Whatcom County restored? When you compare to the low point, when this.
Restored habitat, that's a different question. Like restoring access to existing habitat. That's, yeah, but restoring habitat, I mean, you're right, people just gotta fish through a culvert and then back into another ditch in a farm field.
How is that measured? Is there some point in history that you say, well, the fish were, you know, it's at a certain level at this time and we're trying to bring them back?
Yeah, I think,
To that point?
I think it gets. If I just use like North Linden, I'm not meaning to pick on anybody. But where there's been serious alteration of that's not really hydrology. What's it called, Annika? Hydrography? Like you've taken creeks and then you put them into ditches, then you jump them, you turn right, you turn left, and you're just trying to drain land, basically. I mean, to restore all that drainage pattern in an area of high agricultural productivity is probably not feasible. I mean, I don't know if people will let you. So that's maybe where you say, well, it'd be nice to work here, but you can put a lot of money at it and you're still going to end up on a ditch on the side of a road. Maybe we should focus over here where you know you have good habitat upstream. And backing up, you know, to that numbers we talked about, $60,000. That's, well, without permitting, with permitting and installation and everything, you know, that's a few months' work, and instantly fish have access to maybe 2 miles of habitat that they couldn't get to. So to me, that's the best $60,000 you could ever spend. Not that I don't like planting trees, but you know, that's a long-term thing. For those trees to get old enough to shade creeks, fall into the creek, create pools. I mean, that's I guess I should say that was just but it's humans or myself impatient. You do a fish passage project and boom, it's done. So to me, it's really rewarding just to see that immediate change, specifically if you know there's good habitat upstream that fish could get to if they could get there. And like you mentioned, everybody I've talked to, they don't seem like they want to stop fish. They just inherited a pipe and they don't know what to do with it. So they're great avenues again for state funding, federal funding. So I hope, you know, if people have a barrier, they would take advantage of that. And we do all the applications, we do all the design, the permitting. So we really try to make it as effortless for the landowner as possible, unless they happen to own an excavator and they want to get involved. Oh, one more.
So Joe, from the information about tonight's event, I gathered that you're retiring.
Yeah, I retire in October. I'll be part-time for a little bit. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks for all
Yeah.
the great work.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's been wonderful. Yeah, it's been a treat. Work for a great organization. And a
you're
great boss.
And you're a graduate of Western Washington University.
Yes.
In
Yeah.
which program?
My undergraduate is in geology and my master's was in aquatic ecology. So some kind of dead stuff, you know, rivers, rock, water, and then some live stuff. So I grew up pretty avid fisher person. So I've always been in creeks and rivers all my life.
So are they going to replace your position here at NSEA?
Yeah, they've got two people. One's gonna take the riparian part and one's gonna take the in-stream part. And then another person we recently hired as a grant manager is gonna do the grant writings. Yeah. And they've been working with me. I gave 2 years notice. So they've been working with me a long time. So I think they won't have any trouble.
I have one other question comes to mind. So you're doing the excavations for these projects, you're lifting these bridge members.
Mhm.
Does NC own heavy equipment?
Oh,
Or you
would we
set
would
your
like
stuff
to. I can run equipment, but I'm not the best operator. If there's a good operator there, I'll always get out, but I can lift things and put them in ground. But some people are. Definitely, it's an art, and they can just. There's a guy I work with. They play games where they pick up ping pong balls and drop them into Coke cans, you know, with 200 size machines and don't dent the ball. So there's definitely an art and skill. I don't have that, but there are some amazing operators around, and we do time and materials. We work with about 4 or 5 different contractors.
So this work is subcontracted by.
The construction, yeah, so we do all the oversight and the permitting, the design and the engineering. And like I said, if there's nobody around, I'll run equipment, but there are better people than I.
So
And I think people really enjoy the work, the guys we work with.
So who are some of the local contractors at NCA?
So we used to work with Moseri Construction. Two of the operators there left to recently join a company called Highline. And we've worked with them on a number of projects. We've worked with Harkness Contracting, they're typically a logging company, and Acme on a lot of projects. We've worked with kind of a lot of small mom and pop, one machine, one dump truck. Operations, we've dealt with bigger union shops, but I think we've kind of weeded it down that we like to say have 3 or 4 really good operators, and we'll put out our whole schedule for the summer and try and get somebody that is as organized as we think we are and is pretty nimble. And yeah, some of these people, they're thinking ahead of you. The moment you go to point at something, they've already thought about it, and they've done a lot of these projects with us. So yeah, if you ever want a recommendation of great operators, I could definitely give you one. Yeah, and there's a guy with Jake down in Acme that I've worked with, at least 20 years, and he just loves it. I mean, he just thinks this is, otherwise he'd be digging septic tanks or building road, and he gets to play in a creek, and he's an artist. I mean, he can just do stuff without you even thinking about it. He's already thought about it. And everybody's smiling, everybody's kind of excited and happy about the work. So yeah, I think it's fun. While I would like to have a small excavator, I don't know if my boss is going to let me buy one. They're expensive, and then you need a big truck and a big trailer. And it's just the beginning. And we don't want to compete. We would like to employ local people with that expertise. So it's worked out really well. Any other questions? And I'm around, if you want to call tomorrow or whatever, I'll be here.
It's 7:05 and we want to make sure we're respecting everyone's time. So can we give Darrell a big round of applause?
Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us in person and online. Darrell offered, so he's free and would love to answer any other questions that you might have. We have some of his cards out on the table, so if you want to follow up with him, feel free to do that. Or if you have any questions about NC, you can ask me or Amy. We have a lot of cookies left over, so please grab one on your way out. And again, yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your night.